please. Lord, for the sake of all living things, may my words not be trite. For the sake of all living things, may your word be heard. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer, you, not me. Amen. How close to suffering are we willing to get? How close to suffering are we willing to get? There's no way, there's really no sense even in sugarcoating this message today. How close to suffering are we willing to get? If it gives you a little distance, then think about it this way. How close to suffering are we willing to get today? In this passage from Mark 8, Jesus tells us that when it comes to suffering, he tells us here that we need to be right there. Now, the title of this sermon is What Makes Jesus Indignant? And in Mark 8:31 through 38, we do see Jesus becoming indignant. Why is Jesus so indignant here? Why do you think Jesus is so indignant here? I think he becomes indignant here because he thinks that his disciples know better, only to find out almost immediately that they do not. You see, Peter has just confessed Jesus as the Christ, and that means something. If Peter, who speaks for all the disciples, can confess Jesus as the Christ, then that means that now the disciples really know who Jesus is. And if that's the case, then finally at last, Jesus can tell them what will happen to him next. And this is extremely important in the Gospel of Mark, because in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' identity is often kept a secret. In seminary, we talk about Mark in secrecy, and what that means is that when Jesus heals someone in Mark, he usually tells them, tell no one who has healed to you. Jesus keeps his identity a secret in Mark, so it is really quite a significant moment when Peter can confess who Jesus is. That means that Jesus can tell him what happens next. And what happens right before this is really amazing, because right after Peter confesses Jesus turns around and tells the disciples not to tell anyone who he is. So it's almost as if Jesus is still protecting his identity. But still with the disciples, in light of Peter's confession, Jesus feels that he can talk openly with his disciples now. Yet right away, immediately, to use one of Mark's favorite words, right away, immediately, Jesus learns that they still don't get it, that they still don't understand, and that they even resist understanding his mission and understanding his identity as the Messiah, as the Christ. They can say that they know who he is, but they don't really want to understand it, and so they refuse him. They refuse him, and to refuse him here means denying him. And that's why Jesus, I think, gets so indignant here, because to refuse him means to deny him. We see as Peter takes Jesus aside, and as Mark tells us without going into detail, Peter begins to rebuke Jesus. And that's really severe, because in the Gospel of Mark, rebuking is done to no one but demons. So even though Mark doesn't tell us what Peter says to Jesus, we know it had to be flat out inappropriate. And so Jesus, it's almost shocking, Jesus turns away from Peter, turns back to his disciples, and rebukes Peter in such strong language, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Peter doesn't want to see Jesus suffer, and there seems to be nothing wrong with that, but to deny the suffering that Jesus has just announced means to deny him as the Christ and to deny his mission. And Jesus doesn't want any of that. He won't have any of that. Jesus wants our minds set on divine things. And that's why I think Jesus gets so indignant here, because he wants our minds set on divine things, but finds out here that even with his disciples, their minds are set on human things. Now, what do you think we are supposed to make of Jesus' indignation here? What do you think we are supposed to make of Jesus' indignation? What do we supposed to do with what he tells us? I think we need to take seriously what he tells us here. I think we need to take what he says here seriously. And what he says is not pretty, because he says to us, "Take up your crosses and follow me." Now today we can think of the cross as salvation. I have a lovely cross here on the table in front of me. Back then the cross only meant one thing, and that meant brutal execution. That's all the cross meant back then. Back then the cross only meant brutal execution. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew that. Feasting on the Word, a commentary I read every week, says of this passage that once in the year 6 AD, 2,000 insurrectionists were crucified in Israel. That was only 24 or 25 years before this passage takes place, and that means that many in the crowd probably remember those executions. Many in the crowd probably remember 2,000 people hanging on crosses. Many in the crowd probably saw that, even the disciples themselves, and even if they didn't see it, it's so fresh in their minds, it's something they probably repeat. Imagine 2,000 crosses. That's what these people have in their minds as Jesus talks here. Imagine 2,000 brutal executions. Maybe that's part of Peter's struggle here, because to anyone then, to hear a Messiah talk about a crucifixion would just be bizarre. A Messiah back then wasn't someone who got crucified. A Messiah back then was someone who got a crown. A Messiah back then wouldn't talk about resurrection, because a Messiah in that mindset would never die. Imagine all of this going on in the minds of Peter and of the crowds as Jesus tells the crowds, "Take up your crosses and follow me." Now add to that we are in the crowd that Jesus speaks to, and we hear Jesus say to us, even today, "Take up your crosses and follow me." I said a moment ago that I think we need to take what Jesus says here seriously. Can we take this seriously? Jesus' words to us, "Take up your crosses and follow me." Can we take this seriously in order for us to focus on divine things rather than human things? Can we do that? Can we take these words seriously? And can we ask ourselves, how do we translate this now? How do we translate what Jesus says now? Does this still apply to us today? When Jesus says to take up our crosses and to follow him and to give up our lives for the sake of the gospel, does that still apply to us today? It must. It must, church. So how are we going to apply this? How are we going to apply what Jesus says today? How are we going to lose our lives for his sake? None of us needs to go to the cross. That's been done. None of us needs to do that. That's not in anymore. But where do we need to go, church? Where do we need to go, and what do we need to do to lose our lives for his sake? Whose lives do we need to get involved in other than our own and each other's? Whose lives do we need to get involved in? Where can we no longer deny the suffering of today, the suffering of others today? And church, how are we going to get there? I said that Jesus says we need to be right there where suffering is going on today. Church, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get there? Put another way, let me ask you this. How uncomfortable do we need to become for Jesus? We can't hold on to our lives at the expense of not listening to what he says here. How uncomfortable do we need to become for Jesus? What do we need to deny ourselves, and what temptations, if any, do we need to deny, do we need to put behind us to serve Jesus and to be close to his gospel? You know, I said 2 weeks ago that what Jesus says often frightens us, and I said then that it isn't always meant to make us comfortable. So church, how uncomfortable will we make ourselves for Jesus? How close are we willing to get to suffering for the sake of his gospel when he tells us to take up our crosses and follow him? Church, there's a lot of suffering around us, and we know that. There's a lot of suffering around us. Some of you see it when you go to mobile meals and help with that on the last Thursday of the month. There's a lot of suffering around us. Some of you may have seen it at the Nest program, which I know used to meet in this church and meets at other churches now. There's a lot of suffering around us. We see those who suffer. We saw them when we went to Park Place to help out with the community meals there that are now going on at other churches. We saw this suffering when we went to Monumental last November, some of us, to help with their last community meal of the season. We can see the suffering if we go over to St. Mary's to help with the food pantry on Wednesday morning or with the community meals there. They can go all week. Saturday morning is where the breakfast is held. That used to be held at Park Place. There is a lot of suffering around us, church. How close will we get to that suffering for the sake of the gospel? I go to St. Mary's because we need to go where there is suffering. We need to go there for the sake of the gospel. I've gotten involved to the extent that I've been able to with the Virginia Beach Justice Initiative, which deals with human trafficking, going to a couple of their prayer meetings last month and hoping to resume that soon when things calm down here a little bit, because you know what's going on here, and there's been a lot going on here in the last 2 months. I do that, church, because I think it's time for us to focus on service projects. Church, I think it's time for us not just to focus on service projects, but to be involved in service projects. It's one thing to say we're going to focus on service projects, but church, we need to be present in service projects. And that's one of the reasons that I stopped teaching Bible study after the first of the year, because I don't think it's time for me to focus my energy on Bible study. I think it's time for me to focus my energy and to lead the church into service projects. That's one of the reasons why I've moved away from the idea of pub theology that I was talking about last year. There's nothing wrong with that, but church, I think we need to be present in service projects. What are the service projects, church? What are the service projects? What are the opportunities? What are the needs that are near and dear to your hearts and that reflect for us taking up our crosses for the sake of the gospel? To use the same words at the conference, ask pastors every year, where does your passion intersect with the world's needs and the world's suffering? Where does your passion intersect with the world's needs and the world's suffering? Because church, at that intersection, you know what you're going to find? Your ministry. That's what we find, church, at the intersection of our passion with the world's needs and sufferings. That's where we find our ministry. What is our ministry, church? When I was asked that question by the conference, my answer regarded human trafficking. Church, what are our answers? Where does your passion intersect with the world's suffering and the world's needs? Where does your passion intersect with Jesus' mission and Jesus' gospel? Again, church, how close are we willing to get to suffering for his sake, to the suffering of today for his sake and for the sake of the gospel? Where does our passion meet the world's needs, church? Where is our ministry? Amen. Thanks be to God.